So, I'm going to be giving a short summary of the first two chapters of the book A Game of Thrones, written by the esteemed fantasy writer George R. R. Martin, and afterwards I'm going to be analyzing the magical inventory and the general setting of the first two chapters. So, as we start out we meet Bran Stark, who is nervous from excitement from finally being deemed old enough to ride out with his lord father, Eddard Stark, also known as Ned Stark, and his two older brothers, Robb Stark and Jon Snow, to see the king's justice done. In this case beheading a brother of the Night's Watch, who has deserted from his duty of guarding the wall. So, after the brother of the Night's Watch is forced down in the center of the square on this ironwood stump, Theon Greyjoy, who is a long-standing ward of House Stark, hands Ned Stark his magical sword Ice, and then after he does a small ceremony, he promptly takes off the head of the brother of the Night's Watch in one sure stroke. Now, then they start back on their trek to Winterfell, which is the castle that the Starks inhabit, but not before they come across a dead direwolf, surrounded by its pups. Considering that direwolves haven't been spotted beyond the wall for hundreds of years, many of the men who accompanied Ned Stark out to see this beheading call it a bad omen and suggest that they kill the pups rather than let them starve. And despite Bran and Robb's best efforts, Lord Eddard Stark seems set on his way on killing the pups. But not before Jon Snow steps in and points out that there are 5 direwolf pups, one for each of his true-born children. And he also reminds him of the fact that the direwolf is the sigil of his house. And this seems to change his mind. And he promptly decides that the children are allowed to keep the pups, on the condition that they raise them by themselves, and they carry the responsibility that falls with it. Now, then they set out again, but not before they come across a 6th albino pup, which then Jon Snow declares to be his. In the second chapter, we're introduced to Ned's wife, Catelyn Tully, who is hurrying over to her husband Ned with a seemingly important letter. Now, she finds Ned sitting in Winterfell's Guardswood, which is a tiny forest where the men of the North pray to the old gods. And Catelyn hands Ned the letter, where it's revealed that Jon Arryn, hand of the King of Westeros and long-standing friend of Ned Stark, is dead. Of course, this brings great sadness to Ned, but that doesn't last very long, considering that the letter also informs them that Robert Baratheon, King of Westeros and also a long-standing friend of Ned Stark, is coming to visit. Now, we're gonna start analyzing the medical inventory. So, we're introduced to several items that fit on the category of medical inventory throughout the text. As for example, we can start off with Ned's sword, Ice, which we know has some magical capabilities since it's quite literally described as, and I quote, "Forged in Valyria, before the doom had come to the old freehold, when the ironsmith had worked their metal with spells as well as hammers." And from this we can gather that there is something magical about the sword Ice. Furthermore, there are the direwolves that the Starks acquire at the end of the first chapter. And we know that there's something spectacular, at least not otherworldly, about them, certainly for the fact that direwolves also existed in our world, many hundred years ago, and just, considering the sheer size of them. We also have the different deities of the world of Westeros, which, in the second chapter we're introduced to the Seven, being one of the primary religions of the world of Westeros, and also the old gods, who are described as being the nameless, faceless gods of the Greenwood. Which then leads on to another subject of the category of medical inventory, being the weirwood, which we can gather from the text are massive birch trees with leaves that look like red crooked hands and big old faces carved into them with old knowing eyes red with dried sap. Catelyn actually describes the eyes of the weirwood to be, and once again I quote, "old those eyes, older than Winterfell itself," and from which you gather that there is something otherworldly about the weirwoods. And lastly, we're informed that in the lands of Westeros, the seasons seems to change on a yearly basis, or more specifically that they have several years of summer at a time, which is then usually followed by an even longer winter. Now, the general setting of A Game of Thrones has certain qualities that it shares with our world. As for example, we know that in the world of Game of Thrones, they have consistent biomes like in ours. They have the cold north and the hot south and all that. We also know that their world is partly inhabited by humans, just like ours. And also that they have 4 different directions, them being north, south, west, and east. We also know that the world in Game of Thrones is a secondary world, which is consistent and not connected to our world, the primary world, in any way. Furthermore, we know that it's a traditional secondary world, considering that it has its own factionary time of age, but it still draws resemblances from our medieval age. And that was my short summary and analysis of the first 2 chapters of the book A Game of Thrones.